Police began a briefing by stating plainly that the case involving Rob Reiner, Michelle Reiner, and their son Nick Reiner was being discussed because misinformation had begun to overwhelm verified facts. Officials said the purpose of releasing additional details was not to inflame public fear, but to explain why investigators themselves were deeply unsettled by what they found inside the home. From the outset, they emphasized that nothing about the scene resembled a typical planned crime. According to police, the first shot came for what happened after the deaths. Investigators confirmed that Nick Reiner did not immediately leave the residence. Instead, he remained inside for an extended period, during which he interacted with the bodies of his parents in ways officers described as deeply disturbing but unstructured. Authorities clarified that these actions were not organized, symbolic, or designed to communicate a message. They were inconsistent and appeared driven by panic rather than intent. Police revealed that the bodies of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were moved from their original positions. However, this movement did not follow any logical pattern. The bodies were not hidden, transported away, or positioned to mislead investigators. Officers stated that the movement appeared impulsive, as if Nick Reiner was attempting to alter what he was seeing rather than manipulate evidence. This detail, police said, sharply contradicted early online claims of calculated staging. Another point investigators stressed was the absence of deliberate degradation. There were no signs that Nick Reiner attempted to desecrate, display, or mark his parents' bodies. No writing, symbols, or objects were used to create meaning. Police said this distinction was crucial because it separated the case from crimes driven by hatred or ideology. What they observed pointed instead to emotional collapse. The condition of the house further reinforced this conclusion. Police confirmed there was no meaningful cleanup effort. Blood evidence was not systematically removed. Surfaces were not wiped down. Trash was not collected or disposed of. Lights were left on. Doors were left open. And personal items were scattered without purpose. Investigators said this lack of concealment suggested that Nick Reiner was not thinking about escape, prosecution, or consequences. Police also addressed the most troubling question raised by the public: why no call for help was made. Authorities confirmed that during the time Nick Reiner remained in the house, he did not contact emergency services, family members, or friends. Officers described this period as one of paralysis rather than planning. Mental health consultants working with investigators explained that in extreme psychological breakdowns, individuals can become frozen, unable to act even when action seems obvious to outsiders. Investigators were careful to clarify that nothing in their findings suggested enjoyment, pride, or satisfaction. Police stated there was no evidence that Nick Reiner took photographs, recorded messages, or revisited the bodies in a manner consistent with gratification. Instead, his behavior reflected avoidance and withdrawal. Officers said this distinction mattered because public fear was being fueled by assumptions of intentional cruelty. When discussing Rob Reiner, police emphasized that there was no known history of fear, threats, or protective measures taken against his son. There were no restraining orders, no documented violence, and no reports suggesting imminent danger. This absence of warning signs deeply unsettled investigators because it reinforced how suddenly the situation escalated. Authorities acknowledged that the world's reaction was rooted in proximity. This was not a crime involving strangers. It occurred within a family, inside a home, involving a father known globally and a son known privately. Police said this closeness made the case especially terrifying to the public because it challenged the assumption that familiarity guarantees safety. Officers also addressed speculation that Nick Reiner acted with long-term intent to harm his parents' legacy. Police stated unequivocally that no evidence supported that claim. Nothing found at the scene suggested revenge, messaging, or ideological motivation. Investigators said the actions taken after the deaths were reactive, fragmented, and lacked continuity. Mental health evaluations and toxicology testing, police confirmed, are ongoing. Authorities warned against drawing conclusions before those results are complete. They reiterated that explanation does not equal excuse and that accountability remains central to the legal process. Thus, the briefing concluded, Police summarized why the revelations have terrified the world. It was not because of graphic detail, but because the case exposed how emotional collapse can override reason, how inaction can follow irreversible harm, and how ordinary spaces can become sites of unimaginable tragedy without visible warning. Police ended by urging restraint, accuracy, and respect for the victims. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, they said, should not be reduced to a headline, and Nick Reiner should not be transformed into a myth. This is a real case involving real people, and the truth is unsettling enough without distortion. Police continued the briefing by addressing the specific question that had begun circulating worldwide. What exactly made seasoned investigators describe the aftermath as terrifying? Officials clarified that fear did not come from gore or spectacle, but from behavioral patterns that defied normal human response. They explained that when officers enter a crime scene, they're trained to expect either attempts at concealment or immediate flight. In this case, they saw neither, and that absence unsettled them more than anything else. According to investigators, after the deaths of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, Nick Reiner moved through the house in a way that suggested disorientation rather than urgency. Police stated that rooms were entered and exited repeatedly without purpose. Objects were picked up and put down elsewhere. Some items were moved only inches from where they originally sat. This behavior, officers said, is often associated with someone trying to mentally escape reality while physically remaining trapped inside it. Police emphasized again that the bodies were not treated with hatred or contempt. There were no actions that indicated a desire to punish, humiliate, or make a statement. Instead, the way the bodies were repositioned suggested indecision. Investigators described moments where it appeared Nick Reiner began to do one thing, then stopped, then reversed course. This lack of follow-through was one of the clearest signs of psychological collapse rather than intent. Another disturbing element involved time. Officers confirmed that several hours passed between the deaths and Nick Reiner's eventual departure from the house. During that time, no attempt was made to clean, hide, or alter critical evidence. Police said this contradicted almost every assumption people have about post-crime behavior. Instead of acting to avoid consequences, Nick Reiner appeared unable to engage with consequences at all. Investigators also addressed speculation that Nick Reiner attempted to interact with the bodies in a meaningful or symbolic way. Police stated plainly that there was no evidence of that. There were no prayers spoken, no notes written, no apologies recorded, and no gestures that indicated closure or reflection. What officers observed instead was avoidance. Rooms were left mid-use. Hallways were traversed repeatedly. It was as if the house itself had become a maze with no exit. Police said one of the most haunting aspects was the silence. Televisions were not turned on. Music was not played. There was no apparent attempt to drown out the reality of what had happened. Investigators noted that in many cases, individuals experiencing panic seek noise or distraction. Here, there was none. The quiet remained unbroken, amplifying the sense that time had stalled. When asked whether drugs or alcohol played a role, police reiterated that toxicology results were still pending. They cautioned against assuming intoxication as an explanation, noting that psychological collapse can occur without substances. They also stressed that even if substances were involved, that would not negate responsibility under the law. It would only help explain behavior. Police also spoke directly about Rob Reiner as a father. Friends and acquaintances interviewed during the investigation described him as engaged, communicative, and deeply invested in family relationships. There was no record of estrangement severe enough to suggest imminent violence. Investigators said this made the case particularly chilling because it reinforced how invisible emotional deterioration can be to those closest tied as the world reacted with fear. Police urged people to understand why this case felt different. It was not because of celebrity alone. It was because the sequence of actions challenged deeply held beliefs about cause and effect. People expect anger to look like rage, guilt to look like remorse, and panic to look like escape. In this case, none of those patterns appeared in recognizable form. Authorities explained that this unpredictability is what terrifies the public. If there's no clear warning, no recognizable pattern, no logical progression, then people struggle to reassure themselves that they could prevent something similar. Police acknowledged that discomfort and said it was justified. Human behavior under extreme stress does not always follow rules. Investigators also rejected claims that Nick Reiner attempted to preserve his parents' bodies or show care after death. Police said there was no evidence of protective actions, such as covering, cleaning, or arranging in a respectful manner. At the same time, there was no evidence of intentional harm beyond the fatal acts themselves. The behavior existed in a disturbing middle ground that resisted interpretation. The condition of the house at the time officers arrived reinforced this assessment. Daily life appeared frozen mid-moment. Unfinished tasks, open containers, and untouched belongings suggested abrupt interruption rather than transition. Police described the environment as one where life stopped, but time did not. That phrase, investigators said, captured the emotional weight of what they witnessed. The briefing continued. Police stressed that fear should not turn into fantasy. They warned against turning Nick Reiner into a symbol of evil or turning Rob Reiner into a narrative device. Doing so, they said, risks obscuring the real lessons of the case. The lesson was not about monsters. It was about fragility. The world's terror, police concluded, came from the realization that emotional systems can fail without warning. And when they do, the aftermath may look nothing like what people expect. This case forced investigators and the public to confront how little control we sometimes have over outcomes. Even in familiar spaces, AS officials closed the second briefing. They reiterated that further updates would be factual, restrained, and released only when necessary. Sensational detail, they said, would not help anyone understand what happened. What mattered was recognizing the warning signs of emotional collapse before tragedy occurs. Even when those signs are quiet, police shifted the briefing once again, making it clear that what unsettled them most was not a single action, but the overall pattern that emerged when all evidence was viewed together. They emphasized that the case must be understood as a reconstruction based on verified observations, not as a dramatized legend or internet horror tale. Every conclusion, they said, came from physical evidence and documented behavior, not imagination. Investigators explained that one of the most disturbing realizations came from how ordinary everything looked around the extraordinary violence. The kitchen showed signs of normal use. Furniture was not overturned in rage. Personal items belonging to Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner remained exactly where they would have been on any other day. Police said this contrast between normalcy and catastrophe was deeply unsettling because it suggested there was no gradual buildup visible in the environment. Authorities clarified that Nick Reiner did not isolate himself in one area of the house after the deaths. Instead, he moved through shared spaces. Living areas, hallways, and rooms connected to family routines were all entered. Investigators said this behavior mattered because it indicated that he was not attempting to avoid emotional triggers. He was moving through the very spaces tied to family identity, which amplified the sense of collapse rather than control. Police revealed that at several points, Nick Reiner appeared to stop and remain motionless for extended periods. These pauses were documented through forensic timing analysis rather than speculation. Officers said these moments suggested dissociation, a state where awareness detaches from reality. This detail, they noted, aligned with the lack of purposeful action observed throughout the scene. Another revelation that disturbed investigators was the absence of destruction toward personal objects. Photographs, memorabilia, and items associated with Rob Reiner's career were untouched. There was no attempt to damage or remove them. Police said this contradicted theories of resentment or symbolic rejection. If anger toward his father's identity had been the driving force, they would have expected some outward expression of it. They found none. When addressing public fear, police explained that terror often grows when motives cannot be easily categorized. This case did not fit into narratives of greed, revenge, or ideology. There were no financial actions taken, no statements made, and no attempts to justify behavior. Investigators said the lack of motive was not evidence of innocence. but it was evidence of something more frightening: emotional implosion without direction. Police also discussed the discovery that Nick Reiner did not attempt to leave the city immediately. This detail contradicted assumptions of escape. Officers said that in most cases involving intentional wrongdoing, suspects prioritized distance. Here, proximity remained. This behavior reinforced the assessment that he was not operating with a strategic mindset. Investigators addressed speculation that Nick Reiner may have attempted to fix the situation after the fact. Police stated there was no evidence of repair, restoration, or reversal. He did not cover injuries. He did not arrange the bodies in a comforting way. He did not attempt to undo what had happened. At the same time, he did not amplify the damage. The behavior existed in a suspended state between action and paralysis. Police explained that this middle ground is what caused experienced officers to react so strongly. Most crime scenes tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end. This one did not. It felt incomplete, unresolved, and frozen in time. Investigators said the house felt less like a crime scene and more like a moment interrupted, never allowed to finish unfolding. Authorities reiterated that fear should not turn into myth-making. The danger, they said, was turning Nick Reiner into something inhuman or supernatural. Doing so would prevent people from understanding the very real psychological mechanisms at play. This case, police emphasized, was not about a monster hiding in a home. It was about a mind collapsing under internal pressure. When discussing Rob Reiner, investigators again stressed that nothing suggested he anticipated danger. Friends and family interviews revealed no final warnings, no coded messages, no signs of imminent fear. Police said this absence was haunting because it meant the tragedy did not announce itself. It arrived without spectacle. Police also addressed the impact on the public. They acknowledged that many people were reacting not only with fear, but with recognition. Recognition that families often hide struggles. Recognition that emotional distress does not always look dramatic. Recognition that stability can be an illusion. The world's terror, investigators said, came from seeing how quietly everything broke. No alarms, no confrontation witnessed, no public unraveling, just a sudden and irreversible collapse inside a private space. That realization, they explained, challenges people's belief that danger is always loud and obvious. As the third briefing concluded, police reinforced their commitment to restraint. They said the truth was already heavy enough without exaggeration. What they hoped people would take from the case was not fear of one individual, but awareness of how psychological deterioration can remain invisible until consequences are catastrophic. They ended with a final reminder. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were not characters in a story. They were real people whose lives ended tragically. Nick Reiner was not a symbol. He was a person whose actions had irreversible consequences. Understanding that reality, police said, was the only way to prevent terror from turning into distortion. Investigators explained that what truly caused seasoned officers to go pale was not a single discovery, but the sequence in which everything appeared to have unfolded, according to their reconstruction. In cases involving alleged family violence, patterns usually emerge quickly. In this case, patterns refused to settle into anything recognizable. Every assumption investigators made collapsed when tested against what they found. According to investigative theory, after the deaths of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, Nick Reiner's behavior appeared to move through contradictory phases. At times, evidence suggested frantic motion. At others, long periods of complete stillness. Experts reviewing the scene described it as a psychological echo chamber, where action and paralysis existed side by side without logic. One of the most unsettling details, investigators said, was the way the bodies were allegedly left in relation to the home's layout. They were not positioned to be hidden, nor placed for immediate discovery. Instead, their locations appeared almost incidental, as though the house itself no longer registered as a meaningful space. That loss of spatial awareness deeply disturbed analysts because it suggested a mental state where consequences had ceased to exist. Investigators emphasized that there were no signs of symbolic intent. No deliberate markings. No attempt to leave messages. No objects arranged to communicate motive or grievance. In criminal profiling, symbolism often reveals purpose. Here, the absence of symbolism suggested something far more alarming: emotional collapse without narrative. Experts consulting on the case explained that when a person experiences a complete psychological break, behavior often loses direction. Actions no longer point toward escape, concealment, or justification. They simply occur, disconnected from outcome. That pattern, analysts said, matched what they believed they were seeing. Another detail that unsettled investigators was the condition of personal spaces belonging to Rob Reiner. Offices, memorabilia, and private rooms appeared untouched. There was no destruction of legacy, no targeting of identity. This contradicted theories of resentment or long-term anger. If hatred had been the driver, signs of it would likely have appeared in those spaces. They did not. According to reconstructed timelines, Nick Reiner did not immediately leave the property. That decision alone challenged conventional expectations. In most alleged crimes of this nature, flight is immediate. Here, proximity lingered. Experts said this suggested an inability to process reality rather than a desire to evade it. Investigators also pointed to the absence of any attempt to reframe the scene. There was no effort to fabricate an alternative explanation. No stage accident, no false emergency scenario. The lack of narrative construction suggested a mind incapable of building one. That what terrified investigators most, they said, was that nothing about the scene announced danger beforehand. There were no shattered walls, no violent escalation visible in the environment. Everything appeared ordinary until it suddenly was not. That realization shook even veteran officers. Psychological consultants explained that the most dangerous mental collapses are often the quietest. They do not scream. They do not warn. They simply give way. When that happens inside a family home, the results can be catastrophic. Public fear grew as these interpretations emerged, not because of graphic detail, but because people recognized the implications. If emotional breakdown can remain invisible until after irreversible harm, then safety becomes harder to define. Investigators stressed repeatedly that these conclusions were part of an ongoing reconstruction, not final judgment. Mental evaluations, forensic analysis, and legal review would ultimately determine responsibility. But the behavioral patterns alone were enough to unsettle everyone involved. The terror, they concluded, came from uncertainty, from the realization that collapse does not always look like chaos until it is too late, from the understanding that proximity does not equal protection. AS investigators closed this phase of analysis. One theme remained consistent. This was not a story of calculated cruelty. It was a story of disintegration. And that, they said, is what made the case so deeply disturbing. AS investigators continued piecing together the reconstructed timeline. Attention shifted to what specialists described as the aftershock phase, the period following the alleged acts when behavior becomes most revealing. According to analysts, this phase often exposes whether actions were driven by intent, impulse, or collapse. In this case, they said, the indicators leaned heavily toward collapse, but with elements that made the situation uniquely unsettling. Point one detail that stood out was the absence of any attempt to impose order after chaos. In many violent incidents, even unplanned ones, there is a moment when the individual tries to regain control, if only superficially. Investigators said they saw no such transition here. Disorder did not resolve into strategy. It simply lingered, unresolved, like a question left unanswered. Experts reviewing the scene noted that lighting throughout the house appeared unchanged. No deliberate effort was made to darken rooms, close blinds, or alter visibility. This detail mattered, they said, because people attempting to hide from reality often change their surroundings to feel less exposed. The unchanged environment suggested that the surroundings themselves had stopped registering as meaningful. Investigators also pointed to the lack of emotional substitution. In moments of overwhelming stress, Individuals sometimes seek grounding through routine behaviors such as eating, sleeping, or engaging with familiar objects. There was no evidence of this. Food was untouched. Beds were unused. Personal comforts were ignored. Analysts described this as a sign that the normal anchors of daily life had lost their stabilizing power. Another aspect that disturbed investigators was the apparent distortion of time. Forensic estimates suggested long gaps where no meaningful activity occurred, followed by brief bursts of movement without clear purpose. This rhythm, experts explained, often accompanies dissociation, where the mind disconnects from the flow of time itself. To those experiencing it, minutes and hours blur into something unrecognizable. Investigators emphasize that this state does not resemble cinematic portrayals of breakdown. There was no dramatic pacing, no visible unraveling. Instead, there was a quiet erosion of structure. The house remained intact. The environment remained calm. Yet internally, something fundamental appeared to have collapsed. Analysts also examined what was not present. There were no attempts to document events, no messages recorded for others, no efforts to frame a narrative. In many cases, even those experiencing intense distress feel compelled to explain themselves. Here, silence dominated. Investigators said this silence was not peaceful. It was empty. Public reaction intensified as these interpretations became known. Fear grew not because of new details, but because of what those details implied. The idea that devastation could coexist with stillness unsettled people. It challenged the assumption that danger is always loud, visible, and escalating. Experts cautioned that fear should not turn into fatalism. They stressed that psychological collapse, while unpredictable, often leaves subtle traces long before crisis. The tragedy, they said, is that those traces are easy to miss, especially within families where familiarity can normalize warning signs. Investigators also addressed speculation about whether the alleged actions reflected long-standing internal conflict. Analysts said there was no clear evidence pointing to a single cause. Instead, they described a convergence of pressures, none of which alone would predict catastrophe. This convergence, they said, is what makes prevention so difficult and awareness so essential. As the investigation continued, authorities reiterated that conclusions remain provisional. Behavioral analysis provides insight, not verdicts. Legal outcomes would depend on evidence tested in court, not theories discussed in briefings. Still, investigators acknowledged that the behavioral patterns alone had left a lasting impact on everyone involved. What made the case resonate so deeply, they said, was its ordinariness. There were no warning sirens, no dramatic confrontations witnessed, no clear turning point that could be isolated and examined. The collapse appeared to occur quietly, internally, until it manifested in irreversible harm. Investigators concluded this phase of analysis by returning to the central reason the world reacted with terror. It was not fascination with violence. It was recognition. Recognition that stability can mask fragility. Recognition that proximity does not guarantee understanding. Recognition that some breakdowns announce themselves only after everything has already changed, as officials prepared to move into the next stage of the investigation. One message remained clear. Understanding these patterns is not about assigning fear. It is about learning to recognize silence before it becomes devastation. AS analysis moved deeper. Investigators began focusing on what they described as the psychological residue left behind after the alleged events. This residue was not physical evidence alone, but the emotional imprint suggested by choices, omissions, and stillness. Specialists explained that in some cases, what a person does not do can be more revealing than what they do. And this case was defined by absence as much as action. One absence that stood out was the lack of self-preservation behavior. Analysts noted that after catastrophic acts, individuals often enter a phase where survival instincts reassert themselves. They seek shelter, resources, or assistance, even if misguided. Here, there was no clear pivot toward survival, no effort to secure transportation, no gathering of belongings, no preparation for flight. Investigators said this suggested a mind no longer oriented toward future outcomes. Another detail involved communication. Digital forensics indicated no meaningful outreach during the critical period. No messages seeking reassurance. No attempts to explain. No emotional venting. Experts describe this as significant because communication is often the last thread people cling to when reality collapses. Its absence pointed toward isolation so complete that even reaching out felt impossible. Investigators also examined environmental cues for signs of grounding attempts. In many cases, individuals experiencing extreme stress gravitate toward familiar sensory anchors, such as favorite chairs, personal mementos, or habitual spaces. Analysts found no evidence of such behavior. Instead, movement through the house appeared disconnected from memory or comfort, as if those associations had dissolved. Consulting psychologists explained that this pattern can occur when cognitive processing fragments. The brain stops integrating emotion, memory, and consequence into a coherent narrative. Actions occur without continuity. Pauses stretch unnaturally. The environment becomes a backdrop rather than a context. Investigators said the house seemed to reflect that condition, intact yet emptied of meaning. Another unsettling factor was the absence of visible remorse or self-directed harm. Police clarified that there were no indications of attempts to undo the alleged actions or to punish oneself immediately afterward. This did not suggest lack of conscience, they said, but rather a suspension of emotional processing. In such states, feelings like guilt and fear may not surface until much later, if at all. Experts emphasize that this suspension could be temporary or prolonged, and its duration varies widely. What made this case disturbing was not the presence of a single extreme behavior, but the sustained flatness that followed. The scene did not evolve. It stagnated. Investigators said it felt as though time itself had slowed around the aftermath. Public fear intensified as these interpretations circulated, not because they added sensational detail, but because they removed comforting explanations. People often look for motives to reassure themselves that tragedy follows rules. When experts explained that collapse can occur without a clear motive, that reassurance disappeared. The unpredictability became the threat. Investigators also addressed the idea that warning signs must have been obvious in retrospect. Analysts cautioned against that assumption. They explained that many breakdowns are preceded by subtle shifts that could be mistaken for stress, withdrawal, or fatigue. Families often adapt to these changes without realizing their significance. The absence of alarm does not mean the absence of danger. As the inquiry continued, officials stressed that understanding these dynamics is not about assigning blame retroactively. It is about recognizing patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. The goal, they said, is prevention through awareness, not fear through fixation. They also reiterated that all behavioral interpretations remain part of an ongoing investigative framework. Legal determinations would depend on evidence evaluated in court, not on psychological theory alone. Still, the patterns observed were enough to leave a lasting impression on those tasked with examining them. Investigators concluded this phase by acknowledging the emotional toll on everyone involved. Officers, analysts, and consultants described the case as one that lingered long after briefings ended, not because of violence alone, but because it challenged assumptions about predictability and control. The terror experienced by the public, they said, mirrored the discomfort felt by professionals. It came from confronting the idea that collapse can be quiet, that danger can coexist with normalcy, and that the absence of warning could be the most unsettling sign of all that AS attention turned toward the next stage of the investigation. One principle guided officials' approach. Facts would be released carefully, interpretation would remain cautious, and the humanity of everyone involved would be respected. The aim was not to create fear, but to understand how such fear comes into being. As the investigation moved forward, specialists began examining what they called the psychological afterimage of the alleged events, the invisible imprint left behind when a person's internal framework collapses. This phase focused less on physical movement and more on meaning or the sudden absence of it. Analysts explained that when meaning dissolves, behavior often becomes hollow, repetitive, and strangely quiet, which is precisely what unsettled them most in this case. Investigators describe how the home itself seemed frozen between moments. Everyday objects remained where they were last used, not abandoned in panic, but left as if the future had simply stopped arriving. There were no signs of frantic packing, no attempt to gather important documents, no preparation for what might come next. Experts said this suggested a mind no longer projecting itself forward in time, a state where tomorrow no longer exists as a concept. Another troubling element was the lack of emotional substitution. In many cases of extreme stress, individuals unconsciously replace one emotion with another that feels easier to manage: anger instead of grief, movement instead of thought. Here, analysts said there was no such substitution. Emotion appeared flattened rather than redirected. This emotional blankness made it difficult for investigators to apply familiar frameworks. Specialists also noted the absence of environmental distortion. There was no attempt to rearrange the space to make it feel different, safer, or less real. Curtains were not drawn. Lights were not turned off. Mirrors were not covered. Psychologists explained that when someone is trying to escape reality, they often change their surroundings to reduce sensory input. The fact that nothing was altered suggested the surroundings themselves had lost impact. Digital analysis reinforced this impression. There was no evidence of obsessive searching, frantic messaging, or attempts to anchor reality through screens. Phones, computers, and other devices showed minimal interaction during the critical window. Experts said this was significant because technology often becomes a lifeline during moments of crisis. Its absence pointed toward withdrawal so deep that even virtual connection felt unreachable. Investigators also consider the role of silence. Silence, they explained, is not neutral. In extreme psychological states, silence can become overwhelming, amplifying internal disarray. The lack of noise, conversation, or distraction suggested that the individual remained alone with his thoughts, unable to escape them and unable to articulate them. Public reaction continued to evolve as these details emerged. Fear gave way to unease, and unease to a deeper sense of vulnerability. People were not reacting to violence itself, but to the idea that collapse can happen without spectacle. That nothing needs to look broken from the outside for everything to be broken within. Experts caution that this does not mean such events are random or inevitable. They stressed that collapse often follows prolonged internal strain, even if that strain is not visible. The challenge, they said, lies in recognizing quiet distress before it becomes catastrophic. Familiarity can mask danger, and love can sometimes obscure warning signs rather than reveal them. Investigators also addressed the tendency to search for villains or symbols. They warned that reducing complex human breakdowns to simple narratives may offer emotional comfort, but it prevents understanding. This case, they said, resisted simplification precisely because it involved ordinary spaces, ordinary routines, in an absence of dramatic escalation. As the analysis continued, officials emphasized restraint. Each new interpretation was treated as a piece of a larger puzzle, not a conclusion. They reiterated that behavioral analysis does not replace legal judgment. It provides context, not verdicts. Still, the patterns observed were powerful enough to leave a lasting impression. The terror felt by observers, investigators concluded, stemmed from recognition rather than shock. Recognition that silence can be dangerous. Recognition that collapse can be invisible. Recognition that the systems people rely on for safety are sometimes more fragile than they appear. Attention prepared to shift toward the next phase of inquiry. Officials underscored one final point. Understanding cases like this is not about feeding fear. It is about learning to listen to quiet signals, to take withdrawal seriously, and to recognize that absence of noise does not equal absence of risk. As investigators entered the later stages of their analysis, attention turned to what they described as the long echo of the alleged events, the way actions continued to resonate even after physical movement had stopped. This phase focused on how the absence of resolution itself became a defining feature. Specialists explained that in many cases, there is a moment where events shift toward conclusion. Here, that moment never clearly arrived. Analysts describe how the environment retained a sense of suspension. Objects were neither restored nor abandoned. Doors were neither secured nor left deliberately open. This in-between state suggested an unresolved internal process, as though the mind responsible could not progress beyond the moment of rupture. Investigators said this unresolved quality was deeply unsettling because it denied closure at every level. One aspect that troubled specialists was the lack of narrative behavior. Humans, they explained, instinctively try to create stories to explain actions, even false ones. People lie, justify, deny, or reframe. In this case, there was no sign of narrative construction, no attempt to assign meaning, no effort to define what had happened in words or symbols. The silence persisted without explanation. Experts also revisited movement patterns within the house, noting repetition without destination. Paths were retraced not to achieve an outcome, but seemingly out of compulsion. Analysts said this kind of looping behavior often reflects a mind attempting to process something too overwhelming to integrate. Each pass through familiar space becomes an unconscious effort to restore coherence that never arrives. Investigators emphasize that this pattern did not align with predatory behavior. There was no evidence of dominance, display, or satisfaction. Instead, the behavior suggested fragmentation. Actions occurred without reinforcement, without reward, without resolution. This absence of reinforcement made it impossible to categorize the behavior within traditional models of intent. Public reaction evolved again as these interpretations circulated. Fear began to mix with discomfort, then with introspection. People asked not only how such a tragedy could occur, but how easily signs might be missed when distress expresses itself quietly. The case forced a reconsideration of what danger looks like when it does not announce itself. Specialists warned against interpreting quiet as calm. They explained that emotional overload can suppress outward expression entirely. When that happens, collapse may appear sudden only because its internal progression was hidden. Investigators said this dynamic was one of the most important lessons emerging from the case. Another element that drew attention was the absence of symbolic separation. In many cases, individuals attempt to distance themselves from an event through physical or emotional separation. Here, separation did not occur. Proximity remained. Analysts said this suggested an inability to conceptualize distance, as if the boundary between action and aftermath had dissolved. Investigators also considered the emotional cost of familiarity. Being surrounded by shared history can intensify collapse rather than prevent it. The house, filled with routine and memory, may have amplified disorientation rather than providing comfort. Specialists said this possibility challenges the assumption that familiar spaces are always grounding. As the analysis deepened, officials reiterated that these interpretations were not excuses. They were explanations intended to illuminate how certain patterns emerge. Accountability, they stressed, remains central to any legal outcome. Understanding behavior does not negate responsibility, but it can inform prevention. The terror felt by the public, investigators said, was rooted in the loss of predictability. People want to believe that warning signs are visible, that danger escalates, that intuition will signal when something is wrong. This case undermined that belief by showing how collapse can remain hidden behind normalcy. Experts urged caution in how the case is remembered, turning it into myth or spectacle. They said, risks missing its most important message. The message is not that danger is everywhere, but that silence deserves attention. Withdrawal deserves care. Stillness deserves inquiry. Investigators also reflected on the emotional toll on professionals examining the case. Many described lingering unease, not from exposure to violence, but from confronting ambiguity. The inability to impose a clean narrative left a sense of incompleteness that followed them beyond the scene. As this phase of analysis concluded, officials emphasized that understanding does not always bring comfort. Sometimes it reveals complexity that resists simplification. That complexity, they said, is what made the case so deeply unsettling. The world's terror was not born from graphic detail or sensational discovery. It emerged from recognition that collapse can occur quietly, without spectacle, and that its aftermath may look less like chaos and more like emptiness. With the investigation approaching its final analytical stages, one guiding principle remained. Facts would be presented carefully. Interpretation would remain cautious, and the focus would stay on learning rather than fearing. Only by understanding how silence can conceal collapse, investigators said, can similar tragedies be prevented. As investigators approached what they described as the final analytical stage, the focus narrowed to why the revelations resonated so powerfully beyond the case itself. Officials explained that the public response was not driven by curiosity alone, but by a collective sense that something familiar had been disrupted. The alleged actions associated with Nick Reiner forced people to confront the unsettling idea that breakdown can exist without spectacle, without warning, and without a clear boundary between before and after. Analysts revisited the concept of aftermath, noting that in many cases, the period following an extreme event is marked by attempts at meaning-making. People explain, deny, confess, or justify. In this situation, investigators said, meaning never crystallized. The absence of explanation created a vacuum that fear quickly filled. When facts do not form a narrative, imagination rushes in to supply. Police emphasize that this vacuum is dangerous. It invites exaggeration, myth, and distortion. That is why officials repeatedly stressed restraint in how information was released. They said the truth, even when incomplete, was less harmful than speculation. Understanding what was known, and equally what was not known, became essential to preventing panic from overtaking reason. Experts also reflected on the role of proximity in amplifying fear. The case did not involve a distant threat or an unfamiliar setting. It unfolded within a family, inside a home, surrounded by routines people recognize. That familiarity stripped away the comforting illusion that danger is always external. Investigators said this realization unsettled people more than any specific detail. Another element that contributed to widespread unease was the lack of escalation. There was no long sequence of visible warning signs, no public unraveling, no dramatic confrontation witnessed by others. The transition from normalcy to tragedy appeared abrupt. Analysts explained that when escalation is invisible, people struggle to identify where intervention might have occurred, and that uncertainty fuels fear. Investigators also addressed the tendency to search for a single cause. They cautioned that complex human breakdowns rarely have one origin. Instead, they emerge from converging pressures that may appear manageable in isolation. This convergence, they said, is difficult to detect precisely because each element alone does not signal danger. The tragedy lies in how they interact silently. Public reaction, officials noted, gradually shifted from shock to reflection. People began questioning assumptions about emotional resilience, family dynamics, and the signals they rely on to gauge safety. The case prompted conversations about mental health, withdrawal, and the importance of noticing subtle changes rather than dramatic ones. Experts emphasized that fear should not translate into suspicion of everyone, but into awareness of patterns that often go unnoticed. Silence, withdrawal, and emotional flattening, they said, deserve attention, not dismissal. These states do not guarantee danger, but they warrant care. Investigators reiterated that understanding these patterns does not diminish accountability. Legal responsibility remains a separate matter, determined through evidence and due process. Behavioral analysis exists to inform prevention and comprehension, not to excuse harm. As officials summarized their findings, they returned to the reason the world reacted so strongly. It was not because of sensational discovery, but because the case revealed how fragile internal structures can be, how quickly meaning can dissolve, how easily ordinary environments can become unrecognizable when emotional systems fail. They also acknowledged the emotional impact on those tasked with examining the case. Many described lingering discomfort, not from exposure to violence, but from confronting ambiguity. Ambiguity resists closure. It leaves questions unanswered. And unanswered questions, investigators said, are often more unsettling than definitive ones. Police concluded by urging the public to resist turning the case into legend. Doing so would obscure its most important lesson. The lesson is not that danger is everywhere, but that silence matters. That emotional withdrawal matters. That familiarity should not breed complacency when something feels subtly wrong. The final message from investigators was measured but firm. Fear thrives in distortion, but understanding grows from careful attention. By focusing on verified information and acknowledging uncertainty where it exists, people can respond with awareness rather than panic. The world's terror, they said, did not come from what was found, but from what was recognized. Recognized in the quiet. Recognized in the absence of warning. Recognized in the realization that collapse does not always announce itself with noise. As the investigation moved forward into its legal phase, officials made clear that public briefings would become less frequent. The analytical work had reached its limit. What remained would be decided through formal processes, not speculation. They close with a reminder that behind every headline are real people, real loss, and real consequences. Reducing complex tragedy to fear-driven narrative serves no one. Understanding, however uncomfortable, is the only path forward. As the case entered its final public-facing phase, officials addressed why they would be releasing no further behavioral interpretations. They explained that the analytical work had reached a point of diminishing returns, where repetition risked distortion rather than clarity. What remained, they said, belonged to the courts, the clinicians, and the private grief of those affected. Still, they offered one final synthesis to explain why the revelations had shaken so many people across the world. Investigators stated that the most frightening aspect was not any single alleged act, but the recognition that collapse can occur without a visible countdown. There was no dramatic unraveling witnessed by outsiders, no clear moment where danger announced itself. Instead, the transition from ordinary life to irreversible harm appeared abrupt, quiet, and contained within a familiar space. That realization disrupted a common belief that warning signs are always obvious if one is paying attention. Officials emphasize that this does not mean such events are unavoidable. Rather, it highlights the importance of taking subtle changes seriously. Emotional flattening, withdrawal, loss of routine, and prolonged silence, they said, are often minimized or rationalized, especially within families. Familiarity can create blind spots. Love can normalize behaviors that might otherwise raise concern. Awareness begins by noticing what feels absent, not only what feels alarming. They also cautioned against allowing fear to metastasize into suspicion. The lesson was not to see danger everywhere, but to understand that emotional distress does not always look dramatic. It can be quiet, restrained, and easy to overlook. Responding to that reality requires compassion, curiosity, and access to support, not panic. Investigators reiterated that accountability remains central to justice. Understanding patterns of behavior does not negate responsibility for harm. The legal process exists to determine consequences based on evidence and law, not interpretation. Behavioral analysis serves a different purpose: to help society recognize risks earlier and respond more effectively. AS officials concluded their remarks. They urged restraint in how the case is discussed going forward. Turning tragedy into spectacle, they warned, erodes empathy and obscures learning. Precision, patience, and respect for uncertainty are essential when facts are incomplete and emotions are raw. The final takeaway, they said, was sobering but constructive. Silence can matter. Absence can signal distress. And ordinary spaces can hide extraordinary vulnerability. Recognizing those truths does not guarantee prevention, but ignoring them guarantees nothing changes. With that, authorities closed the briefing, indicating that future updates would come only through formal legal channels. The analytical narrative had reached its end. What remained was the work of justice, the work of healing, and a difficult task of carrying lessons forward without turning them into fear.